Hello good people and welcome back into another Parry This Arthurian Legend video. Today we will be discussing the life and adventures of Sir Morien, a lesser known minor character from Arthurian literature. Despite being lesser known, his story is well defined and very interesting in its own way. This character comes from farther away than most of Arthur's knights, and despite being foreign in nearly every way to the Knights of Camelot, he would eventually join them. His prowess at arms is among the best at court, and he faced off against some of Arthur's greatest knights. Yet, still he remains an enigma in the story, as his appearance isn't until the late 13th century, making him a rather late addition to the tale. However, we are going to dive on in and learn as much as we can about Sir Morien the Moor. Morian was born the bastard son of a beautiful Moorish princess. As fate would have it, one day a bold knight out of King Arthur's realm would ride through the Moorish lands in search of Sir Lancelot, the bold knight of King Arthur's court, who had, of late, gone missing. This knight was no other than Sir Aglovale, a famous knight of the Round Table and longtime servant of King Arthur. Sir Aglovale was one of the many knights searching for the young Lancelot, who had gone missing, and whose absence was a great distress to both the good king and his wife Guinevere. When adventure had brought Aglovale to these strange lands in search of Lancelot, he would come upon the beautiful Moorish princess, and the two would fall in love with each other. The princess would give Aglovale her favor, and the two would make love. However, Aglovale would not stay his quest to find Lancelot, and must needs leave the next day. The princess and Aglovale would profess their undying love for one another, and Aglovale would promise to return after he had completed his sworn quest. What was unknown to Aglovale was that the previous night's lovemaking had conceived a child, who would be born to the princess 9 months later. This child would be a son, whom she would name Morian. This Moorish princess was the only child of the ruler of these lands, and therefore his right and legal recognized heir. However, there were other nobles in the land who held conspiracy against her, and planned to supplant her when her father died. Unfortunately, this would shortly come to pass, as he was old and feeble. By the time Morian was born, the princess's father had died, and the nobles seized the opportunity to dispossess the young monarch of her rightful rule. They declared that as she was unmarried and that she had been defiled, and now had an illegitimate son, she was unfitting to rule, and usurped her throne and took from her all that she owned. She and her son were spared, but set free with no money, land, or food. The young princess would raise her son in poverty, never forgetting the promise of Aglovale to return to her. She would work for food and would find the best tutors she could for her son. She would find many strong and brave men who would teach her son prowess at arms. They taught him to wield a sword, ride a horse, and carry a spear, as well as any other man in those vast lands. His mother had saved up enough money for arms and armor for Morian, and would gift them to him on his 14th birthday. His armor was in the Moorish style, taking its design from the North African warriors who had long ago conquered that land. His helm, shield, and hauberk were all dark black. However, for his arms, Morian adopted a sword and lance in the style of the Britons, from whom he had primarily been trained at arms, and with which he was the most comfortable. Having been raised Christian, Morian would spend a week in pilgrimage seeking God's direction, and would be led to a good knight in prayer at a nearby hermitage. This knight would pray with Morian and quiz him regarding courtly manners, chivalry, and the faith which they both held. The knight would then test Morian at arms, and finding that he was a chivalrous youth with great knowledge of his faith and extraordinary strength and skill at arms, the good knight would knight Morian and bid him to rise as Sir Morien of the Black Shield. Now knighted and armed, Morian would set out in search of his father, Sir Aglovale, in hopes of returning him to this land to marry his mother and repossess them of their rightful inheritance. Sir Morien, upon beginning this quest, would take an oath before God that every knight or man-at-arms that he came across would be impelled to tell him of his father, Sir Aglovale, or would be put to the test by Sir Morien. In this way, Sir Morien made battle with a great many knights and strong men-at-arms throughout the island of Britain. Many of these men knew nothing of Sir Aglovale, or could offer no more knowledge than that he served King Arthur. This process benefited Morian very little, as he lacked in civility and would often insult the men outright before asking anything of them, more often than not leading to unnecessary combat. However, through this process, Morian would gain more experience and strength than he had to begin with, and would become a greater and fiercer warrior. Never in this time would Morian be bested at arms, and each time he would come closer to learning the location of King Arthur's lands, and as the weeks passed, he came closer and closer to Camelot. As fate would have it, one day before noon, as Morian was riding along, he would spy 2 great knights riding towards him. As a stranger in these lands, he did not recognize their sigils, nor did he know them by sight, but he could tell by their arms and armor that they were of rich stock, and by their size and bearing that these were great warriors. Morian rode towards them and raised his spear and spoke his usual challenge. In an all too brisk tone, Morian would declare that they would tell him what he wanted, or he would make them rue their decision to resist him. The two knights would remain seated upon their horses, unmoving. The slightly taller yet thinner of the two, a knight bearing a white shield with 3 red stripes across it, would respond first. He would decry the Dark Knight for his discourteous manner, and say that he would not be compelled by a stranger under threat of harm to part with what he did not wish to give. Morian, more than slightly irked at the dismissal of his command, would set his spear and charge at the knight. The other knight would check his horse and move out of the way, showing no intention of interfering. The tall knight with the white shield would set his spear and charge at Morian. The two knights would meet with a clash, as both of their spears would shatter upon the other. Neither knight would be struck from his horse, both would throw down their splintered shafts of their spears and draw their swords, and combat would commence. Morian would be shocked by the strength of this knight, as with each powerful blow that Morian would land, the other knight would land too, and Morian had never felt such strength in an opponent before. And to Morian's dismay, the enemy knight's armor was so fine that even his strongest blows would glance harmlessly off, with no scratch or dint left behind. On the other hand, the mysterious knight was taken aback in this combat. He had recognized that the young Dark Knight must be a man of prowess, given his impressive stature and high-quality arms, but rarely had he faced such an opponent. There were few knights in all of Britain that could withstand him in this manner, and one of them was riding alongside him, for the mighty Sir Gawain was the other knight, who now sat on the side of the road upon his horse watching the combat. And the only other knights who could offer such a challenge were Sir Tristram of Lyonesse, who was away in Cornwall, and Sir Percival the Red Knight, whom he was seeking, and who this dark black-skinned knight was surely not. Lancelot, for it was he who now fought Morian, marveled at the strength and speed of the young knight, as well as his surety in the saddle, and the incredible dexterity with which he wielded his sword. Lancelot struck the knight on his sword arm and checked his blow, and landed a great blow against Morian's shield, only to be rebuffed, and have a strong blow glance off his helm. Lancelot saw an opportunity to go for the young knight's underarm, which he left exposed when bringing his shield up. But just before he could lunge for his opening, Gawain was amongst them, driving them apart and crying in a loud voice for them to cease this foolish combat. Morian and Lancelot withdrew from the combat, neither ready to accept defeat, but both glad for the respite. Gawain drew himself up in the saddle and dressed them both down. He first addressed Lancelot, as he loved him deeply, and wished no harm to befall him, especially as they were on an important quest for their king. Gawain decried the senseless combat that had befallen the two knights for no reason other than pride. Gawain then addressed the foreign knight and explained that for his lack of courtesy and brash attitude, he could have lost his life this day, and if instead he had politely asked his question of them, they would have done their best to assist him. Morian, still not aware of his peril, would say that he would not stand down, even if they were the two greatest knights in the land, being Lancelot and Gawain of Camelot, of whom he had never seen but had heard great tales. Gawain would then ask Morian to calmly explain what it was that he wished to know, and vowed that if it were in his power and knowledge, that he would help him as he could. Morian would then explain who he was and where he had come from, and explain that he was in search of Aglovale, a great knight of King Arthur's court. Gawain would then identify himself and Lancelot, and Morian would fall to the ground on his knees and beg their forgiveness, as he wished them no evil, and Gawain would raise him to his feet, declaring that no harm had been done. Lancelot would agree and drop from his horse, taking the young Morian by the arm and greeting him as a friend. The three knights would rest together and share a midday meal, and Gawain would explain that he and Lancelot had been tasked by King Arthur with finding and bringing Percival to Camelot. Percival, who was the brother of Aglovale, was Morian's uncle, and was said to be traveling with his brother, Morian's father. So Gawain and Lancelot agreed to allow Morian to travel with them. The three knights would come to a crossroads where a hermit lived. The hermit would see them and come to speak with them. Lancelot would ask the hermit if he had seen two knights pass by, one in red armor. The hermit would say that he had seen them 2 days past, but had not noticed which direction they rode in, as he immediately went back to prayer after spotting them. Gawain would be upset that he had not seen the way that the knights had gone, but would thank the hermit for his help. At the crossroads were 4 roads. The road they had come from, which led back into King Arthur's lands. Then there were 3 roads branching off in different directions. Gawain asked the hermit if he knew of these roads. The hermit pointed to the road furthest to the right and said that this path led to a harsh land, filled with evil men and bandits, ruled over by a corrupt family who held the land in terror. He said that any man who wanted to keep his horse and life should not go down this road. He then pointed to the middle road and said that down this road lay a wasteland that had been devastated by an evil beast, that has killed anyone who has tried to slay it. Finally, the hermit pointed down the path to the left and said that this road leads to the sea. Lancelot would decide that to continue the quest, they must part ways here. Lancelot would go down the central path, believing that he was best suited to kill the beast. Gawain would claim the path to the right, and they would agree that the young Morian should follow the path to the sea. Gawain would tell Morian to ride swiftly and return to the crossroads if he found nothing. Then they would separate and go their own ways. I will now briefly summarize Gawain's adventure as it pertains to Morian. Gawain would start down his path, and after riding for a few hours, he would spy a cruel knight driving a woman before him. She was riding a poor hackney, and he was striking her with his fists, and she was crying. Behind them, perhaps a mile or more off, Gawain could see a great force of armed men. Gawain would ride to the maiden's aid, and she would beg him for help. Gawain would challenge the knight to explain why he was treating her so harshly or to face him in combat. The evil knight would set a spear and charge at Gawain. Gawain would set his own spear and charge at the knight. Both spears would break, but Gawain would drive his enemy to the ground. Once on the ground, Gawain would again offer the knight a chance to explain himself, but the knight would only draw his sword and attack Gawain. Gawain would leap from his horse, drawing his own sword. After a short but intense fight, Gawain would strike the knight in the neck, shearing through his gorget and nearly severing his head from his body. The cruel knight would fall to the ground, dead. As this happened, the knight's men would come upon them, and seeing him dead, would all attack Gawain at once. Gawain would again mount his horse and slash hither and thither, killing and wounding the men in droves. While this was happening, the maiden's friends would ride up from behind, rescue her, and flee, not wanting to engage the enemy army. Gawain would continue fighting for an hour or more, killing or wounding every enemy that did not flee before him. Seeing his victory at hand, Gawain would ride off down the road, seeking food and shelter for the night. After riding for several hours, Gawain would espy a castle from afar. Seeing that this hall was the only habitation in sight, Gawain would ride for it, seeking refuge. The lord of the hall would welcome him and proclaim that while under his roof, Gawain will have his protection and will be fed and housed as well as he could. Gawain would enter the castle, not knowing that this man was the father of the knight that he had just slain. They would feast for a while before the men who had fled from Gawain were at the gate calling to be let in. They would enter the castle bearing the body of the evil knight, and as they entered the hall, the evil knight's wounds would begin to bleed again. The men would say that his killer must be among them. Then they would spot Gawain and demand to know who he was. The lord would say that he was his guest, and as such was under his protection. The lord would lead Gawain to a tower where he would lock him inside and keep the keys for Gawain's protection. The lord would then instruct 100 of his best and strongest warriors to leave and wait in ambush for Gawain. He would then instruct his seneschal to return Gawain's gear to him, and allow him to leave. The seneschal would steal Gawain's good sword and replace it with a terrible one, and would sabotage Gawain's harness and saddle. When Gawain was armed, he would leave the castle and ride off down the road. After a while, Gawain would come to a spot where the woods grew close to the road, and suspecting a trap, Gawain would go to stand in his stirrups. As he did, the stirrups would burst, and his saddle would slide from the horse, leaving Gawain on the ground. Gawain would leap to his feet as 100 strong knights would leap from the bush and surround him. Gawain would draw his sword, but the cheap steel was as brittle as glass, and would break at the hilt after only 3 strikes. Gawain would fight like a cornered boar, but with his armor falling off from the sabotage, and with no weapon, he could do little. Even when he managed to seize a weapon from his attackers, he would only manage a few blows before it would break. Despite fighting fiercely and killing a number of his attackers, he would be overwhelmed. The knights would tie Gawain and bring him to the crossroads where Gawain had started the mission. There they would begin construction of a wheel on which they intended to break him, and leave him for the crows as an insult to Arthur and all of his knights. Here we will leave this tale and return to Morian. Sir Morien rode with all haste towards the ocean. He was following the tracks left by 2 horses that appeared to be fresh, no more than 2 days old. He would follow these tracks all the way to the sea, where he would see many boats at harbor. Morian would call out to the sailors, asking if they had seen 2 knights, one of them in red armor. However, the sailors would be terrified of Morian, as he was taller than any man they had ever seen, and as dark as burnt pitch. All of the sailors would put to sea and flee from Morian. Sir Morian would be distraught by this event, but would decide to return to the crossroads to seek the counsel of his friends. And as he had not eaten anything since they had parted, he rode fiercely back to the crossroads, mostly out of hunger. Upon approaching the crossroads, Morian saw a great many men constructing a wheel, and noticed a bloody man tied against a tree to the far side of the crossroads. The bloody man, of course being Sir Gawain, would call out to Morian, "Alas, brother, I will soon be dead if you and God do not lend me aid." In response, Morian would draw his sword and charge the enemy soldiers. He would strike on his left and on his right, with blows so mighty that he cleaved many of them through the side or down through the helmet to their teeth. Morian would fight through to Gawain, who he would set free with a single slash. Gawain would arm himself, and despite being severely wounded, would fight with Morian against their foes, till all of them were dead or had fled in terror. Sir Morian would help Gawain inside the hermitage to rest. Gawain, who was the greatest healer in the land, would begin treating his own wounds, and the hermit would supply Morian and Gawain with the food that he had, as well as fresh water to drink and to bathe. Gawain would rest for a day to heal, and although he wasn't ready to set forth on the 2nd day, he would make repairs to his saddle and his harness, fixing all the damage that the evil Lord Seneschal had done. They planned to rest the night and set out the following morning, but with the rising sun arrived another knight riding down the road from Camelot. Gawain recognized the knight as his youngest brother, Sir Gareth. Sir Gareth had ridden forth in search of Gawain and Lancelot, as terrible events had befallen Camelot. King Arthur had been captured by a Saxon force while hunting, and the King of Ireland had invaded Camelot and was laying waste to the kingdom. With King Arthur gone, Gawain needed to return to lead, and they sorely missed Gawain and Lancelot on the battlefield. Gawain would tell Gareth that Lancelot was not there, and that he would need to go get him. Gareth would give Gawain his sword, which was an excellent weapon, and Gawain would set off down the middle path to seek for Lancelot. Lancelot had around this time finally found and encountered the evil beast, and engaged it in battle. The beast would inflict great damage on Lancelot, rending his armor to the flesh and hurting him sorely. However, Lancelot would eventually get an opportunity and would drive his sword through the open mouth of the beast, killing it. However, a treacherous knight who wanted to claim credit for slaying the beast would watch the whole fight. After Lancelot had slain the beast, he would approach, claiming to be there to help, and when he got close, would strike Lancelot on the head, knocking him unconscious. He would then cut the foot off of the beast and make to leave, assuming that Lancelot was dead. Just as this was happening, Gawain would ride up, and seeing his friend on the ground, and the knight attempting to steal his horse, Gawain would charge the cowardly knight, leaping from his horse. Gawain would tackle the knight to the ground, and demand that he explains himself immediately. At this time, Lancelot would awake and call out to Gawain, telling him to slay the knight as he was foul and deserved no better. Without hesitation, Gawain would swing out with his sword and take the knight's head clean off. Gawain would then help the injured Lancelot back to the hermit's cell to heal him. When Gawain had left in search of Lancelot, Sir Morien had learned from Sir Gareth that there was news of Percival and Aglovale. The news said that they were staying in a hermitage as Aglovale was injured and Percival was repenting for his sins. The hermit they were staying with was a friend of the hermit that was with Gareth and Morien, and he told the two knights where to find him. The hermit explained that they would find the hermitage they sought on an island a few miles off the coast, so Morien and Gareth would again make their way to the sea and would hire passage to the island. Once there, they would locate the hermitage, and inside they would finally connect with Percival and Aglovale, who was in fact sorely wounded. Morien would identify himself as Aglovale's son and would confront the knight about his failure to return to his mother after his quest. Aglovale would explain that immediately following his quest to find Lancelot, he needed to return to Britain to assist his brother in reclaiming their lands after the death of his father. Aglovale would apologize for not being there for Morien and would say that he was proud of him and the man he had become. Aglovale would also say that he had never forgotten Morien's mother and that he had not loved another woman since her. Aglovale was too injured to leave, but vowed that when he was whole again, he would go with Morien to his mother and help her to regain what was hers. Morien and Gareth would explain to Percival what had happened in Camelot, and the three of them would leave the island and return to the crossroads where they would reunite with Gawain and Lancelot, who were already on the mend. When Gareth explained the situation in Camelot to Lancelot and the peril that Queen Guinevere was in, the five of them would set off immediately for Camelot. As five of the greatest knights in the realm, the sight of them riding in their wrath was something to behold. It inspired the men of Camelot to stop fleeing and to begin the fight, and it terrified the Irish who gave way before them. After riding for a day, the knights would come to the castle which Guinevere was sheltering in. It had been besieged by the Irish, and there appeared to be no stealthy way to get inside. Lancelot, Gawain, and Morien drew their swords to fight. Tristram in his bright red armor and Gareth in his dark blue armor followed suit. Then Morien spotted a large pavilion set up in a field outside the castle and suggested that it must be the Irish king's camp. Lancelot would suggest that to break the siege, all they must do is to cut off the head of the snake, and so the five knights would charge through the enemy army straight for the king's tent. They would ride hard, cutting and slashing their way through anyone that stood in their way. Dozens of strong knights fell before them, and in a matter of minutes they were at the king's pavilion. They had given no quarter, and any that stirred in their direction were cut down by the expert strikes of Morian and his compatriots. When the confused Irish king stumbled from his tent, Morian would spin his spear around, striking the king hard on the head and knocking him unconscious. He would then leap to the ground, seizing the unconscious king and hefting him onto his horse. The five knights would then ride like hell for the castle gates, and the soldiers inside, recognizing them, would open the gates, allowing them inside. Gawain would then take command of the forces in the castle and would call for a parley with the army at the gates. He would demand the release of King Arthur for the return of the Irish king. The Irish would agree, but before they could deliver, a huge force of Britons had surrounded the entire Irish army. Inspired by the charge of the five knights, the countryside had risen up in arms and stormed the Irish ships, killing all of the enemy soldiers there and freeing King Arthur, who had then led them here. Seeing his defeat, the Irish king begged for mercy and promised to be King Arthur's man and maintain his lands only by his grace. After also promising huge ransoms of gold, King Arthur released him and the remaining Irish returned home. In gratitude for rescuing him and his kingdom, King Arthur would induct both Sir Percival and Sir Morian into the Brotherhood of the Round Table. After a week-long celebration, Sir Morian would announce that he had to return to Aglovale so that they could go home and make things right in the Moorish kingdom. Out of respect for their fellow knight, Sir Lancelot, Sir Gawain, and Sir Percival would all accompany Sir Morian. When they arrived at the hermitage, they found Sir Aglovale hale and healthy and ready to go. So the five of them set off with Morian in the lead. When they arrived in Morian's home country, they were met by a group of nobles who had heard of their approach. Many were ready to welcome Morian and his mother back into power, as things had been quite bad since the other nobles had seized control. However, there were over a dozen nobles that stood in opposition to Morian's return, and they said that they would kill his mother if she showed herself. Enraged, Morian would charge their entourage, and despite the fact that the nobles were armed, armored, and had guards all around them, Morian would cut each of them down in seconds. After all 14 of the enemy nobles were dead, the rest of the Moorish lords would declare Morian's mother to be the rightful heir and ruler of the land, and would swear loyalty to her. Sir Aglovale would marry the princess, and the wedding celebration would go on for 14 days. Sir Gawain, Sir Lancelot, and Sir Percival would remain with Morian the entire time as his friends and brothers of the Round Table. After the celebration was over, Lancelot, Gawain, and Percival would take their leave and return to Camelot. Sir Aglovale and the Moorish princess would rule for years in their lands, having 3 more children, 2 more sons, and a daughter. Sir Morian would become a great leader amongst their people, and as the heir to the throne would lead the armies and rebuild the country's defenses. At times he would return to Camelot when King Arthur would call for him, and eventually he would marry a daughter of Sir Gareth, and they would have children of their own. Sir Morian would eventually side with King Arthur and Sir Gawain in the war that would come after Guinevere's affair was exposed. He would fight valiantly and would survive the Battle of Camelot, and would go on to rule his lands until his death from old age many years later.